Today we are going to talk about a word that we use every single day. In fact, it's not just a word anymore. It's a verb. When we don't know something, we don't say, "I'll search for it." We say, "I'll Google it." But have you ever stopped to wonder who actually built this engine that powers our entire lives? We often think of Google as just a massive collection of servers and code. But the truth is the soul of Google comes from the minds of two very specific, very brilliant and somewhat unusual people, Larry Page and Sergey Brin. To understand Google, you have to understand them. That is exactly what we are going to explore today with the book The Google Guys by Richard Brandt. This book peels back the curtain to show us not just the history of the company, but the psychology of its founders. We are going to look at how two quiet computer geeks from Stanford University didn't just want to build a search engine. They wanted to organize the world's information. We will see how their unique childhoods, their monastery education, and their burning desire to do things differently created a company culture unlike anything the world had ever seen. This is the story of how they turned a university project into a global superpower, all while trying to stick to their famous motto, "Don't be evil." So, if you're ready to get inside the brilliant minds of the Google guys, let's get started. Chapter 1, The Monastery Kids. To understand why Google works the way it does, we first have to look at how Larry Page and Sergey Brin were raised. You see, they came from very different backgrounds, but they shared one crucial thing that shaped their entire future. Let's start with Larry Page. He was born in Michigan, and you could say computers were in his DNA. His father was a pioneer in computer science, and his mother taught computer programming. Their house was messy, filled with science magazines and gadgets lying everywhere. Larry didn't just play with toys. He took them apart to see how they worked. He was quiet, obsessed with invention, and always dreaming of the future. Then there was Sergey Brin. His story began in Moscow, Russia. His family faced discrimination for being Jewish, and when he was just 6 years old, they made the difficult decision to leave everything behind and escape to the United States for a better life. This experience gave Sergey a deep appreciation for freedom and a bit of a rebellious streak. He was the extrovert, bold, funny, and a mathematical genius. So, how did these two very different boys end up thinking exactly alike? The answer lies in their school. Both Larry and Sergey attended Montessori schools. If you haven't heard of the Montessori method, it's a unique style of education. In a normal school, you sit at a desk, listen to the teacher, and follow the rules. But in a Montessori school, the children are in charge. They choose what they want to learn. They play with puzzles, and they are encouraged to question everything. They aren't taught to follow instructions. They are taught to be independent thinkers. Richard Brandt, the author, argues that this is the secret sauce of Google. Those early years taught Larry and Sergey that they didn't need to wait for permission to solve a problem. If they didn't like how something was done, they could just fix it themselves. They learned to ignore authority if the authority didn't make sense. This Montessori mindset is exactly what they brought to the business world later on. They didn't care about how other companies like Microsoft or Yahoo were run. They only cared about what made logical sense to them. This childhood freedom gave them the confidence to believe that they could organize the entire world's information even when everyone else said it was impossible. Chapter 2, The Meeting of Minds. Now, let's fast forward to 1995. The setting is the beautiful, sunny campus of Stanford University in California. This is where Larry and Sergey finally crossed paths. But if you think they became best friends instantly, think again. In fact, their first meeting was a bit of a disaster. Larry Page had just arrived at Stanford for a campus tour, and destiny had it that Sergey Brin was assigned to be his tour guide. Sergey was already a student there and was known for being quite social and a bit of a show-off. As they walked around the campus, they didn't bond over shared interests. Instead, they argued. They argued about urban planning. They debated the layout of the buildings, and they challenged each other on almost every single topic. Most people would have walked away thinking the other person was arrogant, but for Larry and Sergey, this constant debating was actually a sign of respect. They realized that they had finally found someone who could keep up with their own intellect. They weren't fighting. They were testing each other. Once Larry enrolled at Stanford, they became inseparable, but they needed a project. Larry was looking for a topic for his PhD dissertation, and he started thinking about the World Wide Web. At that time, search engines were very basic. They only looked at the words on a page. If you searched for cat, They just looked for pages where the word cat appeared the most times. Larry had a different idea, a brilliant idea that actually came to him in a dream. He wondered if he could download the entire internet and look at the links between pages. He realized that the web was like a popularity contest. If a really important website linked to your page, that meant your page must be important too. It was just like academic papers. The best papers are the ones that are cited by other scientists. He called this system PageRank. It was named after himself, Larry Page. Sergey Brin, with his incredible math skills, loved the complexity of the problem and joined in. They started working out of Larry's dorm room, building a machine from cheap computer parts. They originally called their search engine Backrub because it analyzed the backlinks of the web. Fortunately for us, they decided to change the name. They wanted a word that represented a massive amount of information. They settled on a mathematical term, a Google, which is the number 1 followed by 100 zeros. But in a happy accident, they misspelled it and Google was born. By 1998, their dorm room project was working better than any major search engine on the market. But here's the twist. Larry and Sergey didn't actually want to start a company. They wanted to be academics and professors just like their parents. So they tried to sell their technology to other companies like Yahoo and Alta Vista for a measly $1 million. Imagine that. They tried to sell Google for $1 million, but nobody wanted to buy it. They were rejected by everyone. With no buyers and a powerful search engine on their hands, they realized they had no choice. If they wanted the world to use their invention, they were going to have to build the company themselves. Chapter 3. The Garage and Don't Be Evil. So Larry and Sergey had been rejected by the big companies. They had no choice but to go it alone. But first, they needed money and they needed an office. They managed to scrape together their first crucial investment from Andy Bake Dalsham, one of the founders of Sun Microsystems. He was in such a rush that he wrote them a check for $100,000 made out to Google Incorporated before the company even legally existed. With that check in hand, they rushed to the bank, incorporated the business, and went hunting for an office. They found the perfect spot in Menlo Park, California. It belonged to a woman named Susan Wojcicki, who, by the way, would later become the CEO of YouTube. She rented them her garage for $1,700 a month. It was humble with a washing machine in the corner and blue carpet, but this garage became the birthplace of the Google empire. This is where the unique personality of the company really started to shine. Larry and Sergey were not your typical businessmen in suits and ties. They were burners, fans of the Burning Man festival in the Nevada desert. They believed in freedom, creativity, and breaking rules. They brought this spirit into the office. They bought bright lava lamps, used exercise balls instead of chairs, and even brought their dogs to work. This wasn't just about being cool. It was strategic. They wanted to create a place where work didn't feel like work. They believed that if you gave smart people freedom and free food, they would work harder and have better ideas. And they were right. But the most important thing that came out of this era was their motto. At a meeting to decide the company's values, an engineer suggested 3 simple words. Don't be evil. Now, that might sound like a joke, but they were dead serious. In the early days of the internet, search engines were evil. They would sell search results to the highest bidder. If you searched for best car, the top result would be whichever car company paid the most money. Larry and Sergey refused to do that. They believed that search results should be honest. They decided that if they were going to show ads, they would label them clearly as sponsored links and keep them separate from the real results. They were terrified that if users lost trust in Google, they would leave forever. This was a risky move. Investors shouted at them, saying, "You're leaving money on the table. Why won't you sell the search results?" But the Google guys stuck to their guns. They believed that being honest would pay off in the long run. And as we know today, that honesty is exactly why we all started using Google. Chapter 4. The search for adult supervision. As Google exploded in popularity, the company began growing faster than anyone could handle. They moved out of the garage and into a real office complex, the famous Googleplex. But inside the company, things were getting a little chaotic. You have to remember Larry and Sergey were still in their 20s. They were brilliant engineers, but they were not experienced managers. In fact, they famously hated management. They thought managers were just bureaucracy that slowed people down. There is a famous story from this time that shows just how unconventional Larry Page was. One day, he decided that the project managers, the people whose job it was to organize the engineers, were unnecessary. So he fired all of them just like that. He wanted the engineers to report directly to him. It was a disaster, and eventually the managers had to be hired back. But it showed that Larry and Sorge were running the company like a giant college experiment. The investors, the people who had given them millions of dollars, were getting nervous. They looked at Larry and Sergey and said, "You guys are brilliant, but you are kids. You need adult supervision." They demanded that Google hire a professional CEO, someone with gray hair and experience to run the business side of things. Larry and Sergey hated this idea. They didn't want a suit coming in and telling them what to do. They dragged their feet. They interviewed candidates and rejected all of them. They essentially told the investors, "We will only hire a CEO if he is a genius like us." Finally, they met Eric Schmidt. Eric was different. He was a veteran of the tech world who had worked at Sun Micro, Systems, and Novell. But more importantly to Larry and Sergey, he was a real computer scientist. He could write code. He was also a burner. He had been to the Burning Man festival. This sealed the deal. They realized he wasn't just a boring businessman. He was one of them. So in 2001, Eric Schmidt became the CEO of Google. This created a very strange power structure that no other company had. Usually a company has one boss. Google had three. They called it the triumvirate. Eric Schmidt handled the sales, the lawsuits, and the investors, the adult stuff. Larry Page handled the products and the vision. Sergey Brin handled the crazy futuristic ideas and the culture. It was the perfect balance. Eric Schmidt provided the stability that the investors needed while protecting Larry and Sergey so they could keep being their wild, creative selves. This partnership is what allowed Google to transition from a fun startup into the most powerful company on Earth. Chapter 5. The IPO Revolution. By 2004, Google had become a giant. It was making so much money and had so many employees that legally they had no choice but to go public. This is usually the moment where founders lose control. Going public means selling shares to the world, and typically Wall Street bankers take over. They set the price. They sell the cheap stock to their rich friends, and suddenly the founders have to answer to thousands of angry shareholders who only care about short-term profits. Larry and Sergey looked at this system and decided they hated it. They didn't want to play by Wall Street's rules, so, in classic Google fashion, they rewrote the rules. First, they wrote a letter to potential investors called an owner's manual. It was inspired by the legendary investor Warren Buffett. In the very first line, they warned everyone, "Google is not a conventional company. We do not intend to become one." They bluntly told investors that they would not focus on quarterly earnings reports. They didn't care about making the stock price jump every 3 months. They were going to focus on the long-term 5, 10, even 20 years into the future. If investors didn't like that, they didn't have to buy the stock. Then came their master stroke. They wanted to ensure that no matter how much stock they sold, nobody could ever fire them or force them to change their vision. They created a special structure called dual-class stock. Here is how it worked. The stock that you and I could buy on the stock market was called Class A stock, and it carried 1 vote per share. But the founders held Class B stock, which carried 10 votes per share. This meant that Larry, Sergey, and Eric Schmidt controlled the majority of the voting power forever. They had effectively built a fortress around themselves. They took the company public, but they kept the keys to the kingdom. Finally, they changed how the shares were sold. Instead of letting bankers set the price, they used a Dutch auction. This allowed regular people to bid on the stock online, cutting out the middlemen. Wall Street hated it. The bankers were furious because they were losing out on millions of dollars in easy fees. They even badmouthed Google on television, saying the company was overpriced. But it didn't matter. The IPO was a massive success. Overnight, thousands of Google employees became millionaires and Larry and Sergey became billionaires. But because of the smart way they set it up, they walked into work the next day with the exact same freedom they had in the garage. They were now rich, powerful, and completely in control. Chapter 6. The Innovation Machine and 20% Time. Once Google was a public company, the biggest risk was that it would become boring. Larry and Sergey were terrified of becoming like the other big tech giants, slow, bureaucratic, and unable to invent anything new. They wanted to keep that hungry startup energy alive, even with thousands of employees. To do this, they institutionalized a rule that became legendary in Silicon Valley: the 20% time. The rule was simple but radical. Google told its engineers, "You must spend 80% of your time on your main job, fixing search, selling ads, and keeping the servers running. But for the other 20% of your time, basically 1 day a week, you can work on whatever you want." They weren't just allowed to goof off. They were encouraged to build cool things that didn't have a manager's approval. If an engineer had a crazy idea, they didn't have to write a proposal or sit in 10 meetings to get permission. They could just use their 20% time to build a prototype and show it to Larry and Sergey. The results were staggering. Some of Google's most successful products didn't come from top-down management decisions. They came from engineers playing around during their 20% time. Take Gmail, for example. It started as a side project by a developer named Paul Buchheit. At the time, everyone said web-based email was terrible. It was slow and had almost no storage. But Paul used his 20% time to build a lightning-gassed email system with a massive amount of storage. When they finally launched it, they gave users 1 gigabyte of space, which was 500 times more than what Hotmail or Yahoo offered. People actually thought it was an April Fool's joke because it sounded too good to be true. Or look at Google News that was created by a researcher named Krishna Burrit. After the tragedy of September 11th, he found it annoying to click through 10 different news sites to get the full story. So, he wrote a script to crawl the news sites and cluster the stories together. He showed it to his boss, and soon it was a global product. This philosophy extended to bigger bets too. Larry Page was obsessed with the physical world, not just the digital one. This led to the creation of Google Maps and Google Earth. They drove cars with cameras on the roof down every street to create Street View, a project that seemed insane and expensive at the time, but is now something we can't live without. Then there was Android. Google quietly bought a small mobile software company and spent years developing it in secret. Everyone thought Apple had won the phone war with the iPhone, but Google's strategy was different. They gave the Android software away for free to phone manufacturers like Samsung and HTC. Their goal wasn't to sell phones. It was to make sure that as people moved from computers to mobile, they were still using Google Search. This was the genius of the Google guys. They understood that you can't schedule innovation. You have to create an environment where chaos and creativity are allowed to flourish and trust that your smart employees will find the next big thing. Chapter 7. When Don't Be Evil was tested. As Google grew from a helpful startup into a global superpower, the world's perception of them began to shift. In the early days, everyone loved the Google guys. They were the underdogs fighting against Microsoft. But now, Google was the giant, and people started asking difficult questions. The biggest challenge they faced was privacy. Larry and Sergey's goal was to organize all the world's information. To do that, they needed data. They scanned millions of books for Google Books, which made authors and publishers furious. They took photos of everyone's houses for Street View, which made governments nervous. And of course, they stored the search history of billions of people. Richard Brandt writes that Larry and Sergey were genuinely confused by the backlash. In their minds, those logical engineer minds, they weren't doing anything wrong. They believed that having more data allowed them to build better services for people. They argued, "Why wouldn't you want us to know where you are? If we know where you are, we can tell you where the nearest coffee shop is." To them, it was efficiency. To the public, it was starting to feel a little bit creepy. But the ultimate test of their ethics came from China. For years, Google debated whether to enter the Chinese market. The Chinese government is famous for censoring the internet, blocking websites about democracy, human rights, and history. This went against everything Larry and Sergey believed in. Remember, Sergey Brin had escaped a totalitarian regime in Russia as a child. He hated the idea of censorship. However, the business argument was strong. If we don't go into China, we are leaving out 20% of the world's population. Isn't it better to give them some information rather than no information? Reluctantly, they agreed to launch Google CNN and censor the results as the government demanded. It was a controversial decision that stained their "don't be evil" reputation. But it didn't last. In 2010, after discovering that Chinese hackers were attacking Google's servers and spying on human rights activists, Sergey Brin put his foot down. In a move that shocked the business world, Google decided to shut down its search engine in China. They walked away from one of the biggest markets on Earth because they felt it was morally wrong to stay. It proved that despite their size, the founders still had a moral compass. They were willing to lose money to keep their conscience clean. This chapter teaches us that running a company isn't just about code and algorithms. It's about navigating the messy, complicated world of politics and human trust. Conclusion. So, what can we learn from the story of Larry Page and Sergey Brin? The Google Guys isn't just a business book. It is a story about the power of unconventional thinking. Larry and Sergey didn't build one of the world's most valuable companies by following the rules. In fact, they succeeded because they broke almost every single rule they encountered. They were told search engines were a dead end. They built one anyway. They were told you can't offer free food and massacres to employees. They did it anyway. They were told they needed to act like a normal corporation to go public. They refused. Their Montessori mindset, that deep curiosity and refusal to accept no for an answer, allowed them to see the future before anyone else did. They didn't just want to build a better Yahoo. They wanted to build a Star Trek computer that could answer any question instantly. Today, Larry and Sergey have stepped back from the daily operations of Google, now called Alphabet. They are spending their time and billions on even crazier moonshot projects, flying cars, curing aging, and space travel. But their DNA is still embedded in every single search we make, every email we send, and every video we watch on YouTube. They prove that you can be smart, you can be weird, and you can be incredibly successful all at the same time. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of our summary of The Google Guys by Richard Brandt. I hope this story inspired you to think a little bit differently about your own projects. Maybe the crazy idea you have isn't so crazy after all. Maybe you just need to trust your own Montessori mindset. If you enjoyed this summary, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you want more deep dives into the best business and psychology books out there, make sure you subscribe to Neuro Whispers and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an upload. What is your favorite Google product, or do you think they have become too powerful? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for listening. Keep reading, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next summary.